All right, we're here. We're recording with Yuri Bezmenov. How are you doing today, Yuri?
Doing well, comrade. Thanks for having me on.
We have a podcast going here just because I like to talk to people who subscribe to me, who are also writers, who are doing well, being productive. And whether we agree or disagree, it's probably more entertaining if we disagree than just give each other a bunch of backslaps. So I appreciate you coming on. My basic understanding of like this name is Yuri Bezmenov was a Soviet dissident. He left the Soviet Union and he talked to Western audiences about the Soviet techniques that they were using to undermine the West. And so, if I had to take that scheme and update it for the modern day, yeah, there's been a lot of stuff about Russiagate and how Russian intelligence is trying to influence the West. But I really see in the long term, I think China is ultimately the in the way that the Soviet Union was kind of the core opposition that then funded all these other opposition movements around the world. I really see China as the patron of Russia today. So anything that Russia does, I assume basically China has signed off on it in some way, that Russia's kind of acting as a proxy. What is your view on the Chinese-Russian relationship? What do these countries want? Can we cooperate with them to what extent, or should we just nuke, the dams and the Yellow River Valley, or the Five Gorges Dam or whatever? I think it's actually three gorges, but we'll make it five once we nuke. Will create new gorges by nuking them. But what is your kind of perspective on all of that? What are these entities? Can we, like the Soviet Union, for example, is it an ideological problem? Can we change the ideology, or is it, a structural problem where it doesn't matter if they're communists or they're capitalists or they're Christian Orthodox or something? We're always going to have this conflict structurally, and then what do we do about that? Or is it a kinetic conflict? Is it an ideological war we have to win? What's going on here?
Yeah, those are big questions, but let me start by explaining how I bridge those worlds. The real Yuri Bezmenov was a KGB defector, and he came to America in the 80s and gave a lot of speeches about this concept of ideological subversion. There's one famous video, it's about an hour long on YouTube that's gotten millions of views. I highly recommend watching it. But he basically laid out the steps of how the KGB was trying to subvert America from within, because his argument is that it's easier to destroy your rival by weakening them from the inside versus trying to attack them James Bond style, or with a hot war from the outside. And when he gave that warning in the 80s, America was very much at its peak. And since then, we've seen every step of that process play out. He said, first, you do a generation of demoralization, where you raise a generation that strays away from the values of what made their civilization great. And then you destabilize it. And then you have a crisis. And then finally, you have the normalization of Marxism, which we were on the precipice of during the 2020 to 2024 period, starting with COVID, the summer of love, George Floyd, and then dodged a bullet last year when the Donald Trump was nearly assassinated. But now he's president again, so we can breathe a sigh of relief. And who am I? I actually have come from a family of people who escaped communism in the Cultural Revolution of China. My father and grandfather were subjected to struggle sessions, and luckily they escaped to freedom in America. And the real Yuri died in 1993. I was born shortly before him, and I felt that he was the perfect anon handle, because my life I've seen up close what demoralization and subversion looks like in the bowels of the far left, or the deep left, to hearken to your handle. Yeah, I went to a demoralized Ivy League university. I lived in a big city, and I worked in various companies that all were succumbing to DEI, ESG, and pushing the current thing. So, I label my Substack as humor because I think that's one of the best ways to subvert subversion is to help people see through the propaganda and then make fun of how dumb those ideas are so that they don't take root and do more damage because we're speaking on the day of the primary of the New York City mayoral election where you could very well have a woke jihadist win that and have a strong position to win the general election in November. So I'll pause there and happy to go deeper into any thread you like.
Are you a Christian?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, this is something I think you've done a podcast with Bad Dad, and I also did a podcast with him, and I think he's Korean American, and we were talking about identity and values, and you're kind of starting with this idea that the enemy, whoever that enemy is trying to undermine hashtag our values TM. We have these values, and it's like there are various attempts to define what those are. So, one of the ways that you could define our values is by Christianity. One of those values is you could say that it's a fundamentally European phenomenon that America is an extension of European civilization. You could also say that our values are universal tolerance, a kind of Unitarian universalism or Freemasonic idea of we're going to include everybody. It's liberalism. Anyone can come from any country and integrate into our system because it's based on individualism and private property. And we're not doing racial collectivism. We're not doing a particular theocracy. It's First Amendment. You have freedom of religion. So those are three different broad. I mean, is there anything I'm missing here? Is there anything outside of that I'm kind of forgetting when people talk about our values that they're referring to one of these systems?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of it. I think the bedrock is free speech, Christianity, family, and a healthy distrust of government. And for almost 250 years, America has persevered and become the shining city on the hill because of those values. And what we've seen play out since Yuri's warning 40 years ago is that those pillars have been systematically eroded away. And you asked before about like who's doing this now because the Soviet Union fell 30 plus years ago and now China is ascendant. It was interesting because I think the Soviets definitely planted the seeds of this, and you just saw a lot of communist sympathizers, like going back to the days of FDR, take control of the major institutions. So now you have universities, media entities that are 95% plus far left people, and those are the individuals who are responsible for teaching our children and giving us the information, the news of the day. So they've continued to drive that agenda on their own. It's very much this machine now. But for sure, China and the Chinese Communist Party specifically, like I have family there. The Chinese people are not enemies of ours, but their ruling entity and Xi Jinping certainly is because they want to become number one top dog in the world, and we stand in their way. So of course, they're a tyrannical regime, but you can't make the argument that they haven't been competent. They've brought a billion Chinese people out of stark poverty and lots of famine in only 30 or 40 years. So they're not stupid people, unlike a lot of the people who are running America. They have methodically found ways to gain power, to build up their infrastructure, build up their economy and technology, often at our expense, both stealing it and convincing greedy capitalists here to outsource our manufacturing base over to them. And for sure, they're latching on to the woke social justice movement to further weaken us. There have been so many instances of Chinese spies being discovered, driving Senator Dianne Feinstein or honeypotting Representative Eric Swalwell with Fang Fang. So for every one of these cases that's discovered, you know that there are dozens that have not been. And they're becoming more open about it. Like now you have with this Zoran guy in New York, a full blown DSA member on the precipice of becoming mayor of New York's largest city or America's largest city. And for sure, there's some ties going on, whether it's donors or influence. There's this guy, Neville Singham, who I think sold a tech company for a couple hundred million and lives in Shanghai. And there's direct traces of his cash flowing into these NGOs and Antifa style cells in America. Like the guy who shot two Israelis outside the embassy in DC a couple weeks ago. Like look how quickly that story got memory hold, because the media does not want to report very much about how much these far left activists are gaining power and able to straight up kill people in the streets. So yeah, I mean this is both coming from within, and it's certainly being supported by our adversaries, because all they want is to see us weakened.
Yeah, I don't deny that China wants to have influence in America and bribes politicians to that effect. I mean, I guess I want to interrogate some of these concepts. So when we say like China's promoting wokeness in America, um, maybe, maybe China is promoting wokeness in America, but then, I guess my perception is that 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, um, China just didn't have the economy that it does today. And it's possible for a country to to outperform in the sense of, maybe you have like Israel, for example. Israel's a very small country. The amount of espionage it does in America and around the world, I mean, it's hitting above its pay grade basically. I mean, they're outsized influence. So I mean, maybe China's like that. Maybe they were a poor country, but they did a lot of espionage. But I look back at like the Ferguson riots in 2014 and a lot of what was going on at that time. And I don't really see a qualitative distinction between what was going on with Occupy Wall Street and, you just go back to 2013 of Sam Hyde doing his TED Talk, and he's talking about the knockout game, and he's talking about, Israel versus Palestine. It's like all the issues that we talk about today were around in 2013, 2014. The Chinese economy was much smaller at the time because it's been growing dramatically since then. And these issues, they take time, right? It takes time. Really, you could even say it's a generational process. It's not something that everybody flips on a dime. It takes time to inculcate these ideas through universities, through academia. And in fact, my model for a lot of this stuff is that first you get Ivy League psychology professors to change their opinion Sigmund Freud back in the early 20th century, 1920s. And then slowly that filters in through the next generation of students who then become Ivy League psychology professors who then influence the next generation, the next generation. So it's this kind of continual rolling process that gets us to this present day. So I see a lot of these woke ideas as not some kind of external, I mean, maybe they amplify those ideas, maybe they help them along, give them a boost or whatever. But I think that the meat and potatoes of it is it's an internal process within America. And the reason why, I think that you look at, Richard Hanania's book on the origin of woke and Werner Zagrebi over on the Gray Mirror talking about, where does this phenomenon come from? A Moldbug says it's Calvinism. You've got the, Jewish conspiracy theories. But I think it's deeper than 10 years ago, because 10 years ago, China's economy was like I mean, I don't have the GDP numbers up in front of me. You'd know better than I would. But it's like they've really only become a world power in the last 10 years. So the idea that.
I'm not saying that China is the main driver of this, nor am I saying that their efforts only started 10 years ago. But it doesn't take a lot of money to take over the thought leaders, if you will, of a country. We do this all the time, exerting our power around the world with these color revolutions. And yeah, I think Yarvin's really spot on about a lot of things, but he's like, all right, if you're an alien and you wanted to take over America, where would you focus your energy on? And you just need to get Harvard and the New York Times on board because they're still regarded amongst the elite as the gold standard of what the smart and correct opinions are. So, yeah, like this stuff has been playing out for decades, and both Russia and China are civilizations that have been around for millennia. They know how to play the long game, and we are only 250 years old, a relative teenager compared to them, and we run our society on very short-term thinking. Our corporations report quarterly earnings, and stocks go up or down by the day. And then on the politics side, we have elections every 2 years. So most of the incentives are aligned towards short-term thinking, maximize profit, get reelected. Whereas, Xi and Putin have been in power for decades each. They're not going to let go till they die. And whoever comes after them is probably going to be like that too. And the czars and the emperors before them also had similar length of reigns, entire generations or lifetimes. So it's just a fundamentally different frame of thinking. And if you're putting yourself in their shoes and you're thinking, okay, how do we take down the US or at least weaken them enough so that we can find new opportunities to expand our power, you gotta think about this in the long game. And I think a seminal moment in American history is in the 60s when you have the first summer of love. You've got the hippies, all the Vietnam War protests, assassinations. So like those people are now 80 or 90, which means that almost everyone alive in America has lived in that soup. And it's a very different set of ingredients, a different set of values than what the founding values of America are. And that's the central tension of what's going on today, is that people are waking up to this. They're seeing how much propaganda and baseline assumptions are totally off. And we're seeing the results in our economy and many other important metrics. Probably more important than GDP are things like family formation, fertility rates. All these things are trending in a very bad direction. So people in our sphere, I think, are fully awake to that, and we're trying to maximize and optimize how we can flourish in the society, in our own lives and our families. But we ultimately need everyone else, country of 300 plus million people, to also come around and make sure that we're not going to keep falling into this abyss of normalization, communism, whatever you want to call it.
So you guys are in a sphere and you're trying to wake up. So let me give you some woke facts, or woke perspective. So Russia's TFR is 1.42. Russia has mass immigration from Central Asian countries, which actually have a higher fertility rate than Mexico. Mexican fertility is under replacement. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, these have some of the highest fertility in the world. And Russia has roughly half as a percentage. So we have like 30 million illegals in the country or something like that. Russia has proportionately something like half of that. It's still pretty significant when you consider the TFR. It's fairly dramatic in that respect. So Russia has low fertility. China doesn't have the immigration. The reason China doesn't have the immigration is because a combination of people don't want to go there, and China doesn't want them there. China wants security. It doesn't want. It already has a problem in its western regions with these high fertility ethnicities, Muslims, Tibetans, and they've been trying to actually purify and homogenize the country. So they don't want to bring in a bunch of immigrants, and also it's not a very wealthy country. Most. It's like $12,000 GDP per capita, so it's not as attractive to immigrants as going somewhere else. So the problems you describe in terms of family size and fertility and birth rate and family values and those sorts of things, I don't see that as a uniquely Western problem. And I think that the civilizations that you're saying are millennia old and they have these 1,000-year plan to take over the West and they're doing it smart and our politicians are dumb. I think that's an oversimplification. I don't think these civilizations are thousands of years old. Russia as an ethnicity, or the Russian ethnicity, really didn't exist. When the Germanics and the Italians and the Gauls, all those ethnicities were already established. Russians didn't even exist. There were some random Slavic tribes living in a bog. And as the Russian state got started, Muscovy really only started expansion, in the 16th century, just about the time when the English were starting to colonize America. So, I don't think Russia is a millennia old civilization at all. And, the Russian system, okay, maybe there's continuity with the KGB. There was a pretty radical change 30 years ago. China, same thing. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, China had an arranged marriage society. It was much more like India. It had a caste system with Manchus at the top. Well, all of that flipped. You got Maoism as a Western idea. You abolished arranged marriage, made it illegal, instituted communism. So I think these societies actually, if you're looking in terms of long range planning of elites in a deep state, I think the American deep state, having continuity with the Whigs of Britain, the Freemasons of Britain, coming over, establishing a new Zion, I think that's actually a longer term plan than anything they're doing in Russia or China. So I reject that framing. I understand what you're saying as a practical matter of, in America, we have a new president every 4 years, and over in Russia and China, they have, 30-year presidents, basically. And yeah, there's a practical matter there where I can agree with you. But if that was the problem, which I'm not even sure it is, because they have low TFR, they have terrible family values. But even if that was the problem, wouldn't the solution be a deep state? Wouldn't the solution be we want to empower the FBI and the CIA and not, drag them down? Wouldn't we want kind of a George Soros type who's like a puppet master pulling the strings? Wouldn't we want to empower Bill Gates as an overlord and a tyrant? Like, why are we attacking these people? And you made a point before, and I'll let you respond.
Yeah, well, I think
Go
you've
ahead.
brought up a couple of fascinating
ahead.
points there. I like just chewing through some of the ideas that you've put forth. I mean, look, the bottom line is the biggest threat to America is from within, for sure. Like, I think if you'd ask most MAGA types, like, who's the biggest threat? The far left within America, Russia, China, or Iran? It's definitely the first. And you're right, like TFR is bad in Russia and in China. China did a very unique thing in world history where they imposed a one-child policy for like 30, 40 years because they just weren't able to feed their rapidly growing population. And that shot themselves in the foot because now their population is going to start declining before they can really be ascendant. So, I think, right, like if you ask anyone which country is going to be better positioned long term, it's still America. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be vigilant, and we also should be focusing on strengthening ourselves versus spending all this time like constantly going after our rivals. There is a way, and I think most people would hope that we can all in every country prosper, and each government can focus on improving the welfare of its people versus fighting it out with each other, doing subversive activities, or even worse, going into war. All these people have nukes now.
Okay. I guess I want to touch on some of these issues that you've brought up as examples of subversive issues, and I believe that COVID and the lockdowns, the economic losses due to shutting down businesses, was probably one of the worst things that the government has ever done in a certain sense. Like in terms of like, obviously there have been things that have happened World War II and the Civil War, right? There have been huge expenditures and they're very costly and a lot of people died. But in terms of something that was basically unnecessary. Didn't really save lives because people are going to the grocery store, and if everybody goes to a central location called a grocery store and they all go inside, and I don't care if they're wearing masks, but they're all going inside, it's like you're not actually slowing the spread. If you wanted to really have a lockdown, you should say, hey, what you're going to do is you're going to go in an app on your phone, you're going to get that, and they're going to come outside and they're going to give you your groceries and you're going to leave in your car. You're not allowed to go inside the store. That would actually be an effective lockdown. We didn't have that. What we had is if you own a barbershop, if you own a restaurant, you're getting shut down. I mean, that was a huge economic loss, and that's still persistent. Like people who went through that period, you look at different age brackets, it's like there's long-term economic effects of that. So, in terms of like self-imposed wounds, I think that's a pretty big one. And is China culpable for that because they created a virus or because they kind of scared the rest of the world into doing these lockdowns? And should we be more vigilant? Should we be more skeptical of China? I think that's all fair. I think if there's a virus that originates in China, I think thinking carefully about that. And also in general, I'm just not in favor of having a risk-averse society, a society where, whether it's Muslim terrorism or a disease or, Andrew Cuomo being creepy to women or like whatever this threat is, I think oftentimes the reaction to it does more damage than the threat itself. So I'm just in favor of being a little bit more cavalier and a little more risk-friendly in general. And that's COVID. And so probably we would agree a lot with COVID.
I definitely can't understate how horrible the COVID period was. Because, you didn't just have like businesses shutting, but you had people's lives upended. And it's hard to calculate the cost of how many people missed doctor's appointments and didn't catch cancer or other diseases. You had an entire generation of youth lose the best years of their lives in high school and college. It just seemed all around a miserable experience. And we had some complicity in COVID because Fauci and his henchmen were doing this gain of function research using our taxpayer funding in Wuhan. And then I think the CCP then weaponized it to remember when they were claiming that if you stop the planes from China then you're racist. Like this is the problem with an open society sometimes, is that they're able to pull these tricks where they would also disseminate all these videos in the early days of people just dropping in the streets dying from COVID. And there's no way that's real, right? Like that never happened with anyone in America, but it immediately got this mind virus into the heads of our leaders to say, oh, well, we have to do things the Chinese way now. Like, screw your freedoms. You forget about freedom of speech, forget about freedom of assembly. We're going to rule the same way Xi Jinping's ruling. And oh, look at them. Like, they locked everyone in their apartments. They can't even leave their apartments, and they were able to flatten the curve. So we should do that too. Right? Like that was deeply damaging to the American psyche. And there's tens of millions of Americans who want to live that way. They want the government me harder daddy, give me more jabs, give me more masks, whatever you say, Commissar Fauci, right? So that's a long lasting scar. But I think primarily that mentality is with the older generation. And I think the younger generation shifted right because they were radicalized by how much of their best years that they lost because of these decisions.
Yeah, I did a video, or not a video. I did an article at one point on this question because Ubersoy basically put forth that vision of the younger generation is turning right, and I kind of went through that, and I said that obviously you have a gender divide that's been widening between women and men. Young women and men obviously can't see eye to eye. They're diverging, and so women are becoming more leftist, and young men are not actually really going to the right. The article is called "Will Gen Z Be the Based Generation?" And I just go through it's an empirical question. I go through the statistics and I say, yeah, I mean, it's not really clear that that phenomena where you're getting this right wing reaction. I think really what it is there's been millennials who were just so far to the left of anything that had ever been seen in history that in relative terms, people look at Zoomers and they say, oh, that's a right wing reaction, when really it's just a slight correction toward the center. But if you compare Gen Z to Gen X or Boomers or whatever, it's still a move to the left. So they're still moving to the left. They're just moving to the left at a slower pace than millennials did. That's my assessment. Some nuance on COVID is that I don't think the jab or the vaccine was dangerous. I don't think it was bad. I mean, every baby gets 37 vaccines. Obviously, RFK has a problem with that. But I think in general, it's just not a big health issue. I think the reason why kids are having higher rates of autism is because of one, overdiagnosis, but number two, women and men are having children much, much later in life, and that massively increases the risk of autism. So those are the explanations I would have for that. I don't think jabs and vaccines are a scary, evil Bill Gates conspiracy to kill us all. And I think that the problem with the lockdowns, um, you know, I think that Sweden did it right. I think Sweden had a pretty relaxed policy. I'm not really that concerned about gain of function research. I guess it's from what I understand. I mean, I'm not an expert. I'm not a biologist, but the idea of like engineering viruses to kill people seems pretty crazy. But it also seems like, a military technology like nuclear bombs or anthrax. I mean, we have been researching weapons to kill millions of people for a very long time, and we already have those weapons. So to me, it's not. I don't think COVID. Maybe it was intended to be a bioweapon, or maybe it was part of a bioweapons program, but ultimately, I don't think it ended up being. It killed a lot of old people, which is not really. Honestly, I mean, I guess this is controversial to say, but like, if the Chinese plot to take over America was like, we're gonna kill all their retired people, that'll show them. It's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm sad that all the grandparents died, but it's not actually doesn't have like a military or fiscal negative impact on the country. So as a
Yeah, well, there's
bioweapon,
lots of other impacts that come from that, right? You
explain.
had well, what do we do in response? We printed trillions of dollars, and overall, during that couple of years, we saw inflation in aggregate of like 20, 25%. So you pushed a lot of people into poverty and financial stress. So it's not simply about the death toll from COVID itself. It's about all of the damage that occurs in other parts of society. I mentioned a few examples before, but that's much harder to calculate. And for sure, just from a life years perspective, like someone who is already old and sick passing away from COVID is not the same as a child or a teenager. And thankfully, the disease was not dangerous to that latter group, but our authorities still behaved as if it were. So that caused much more damage. A wise man once said back then, like the cure cannot be worse than disease, and for sure it was.
No, I agree. The problem wasn't the disease; it was the reaction to the disease. And if the goal is to save the lives of old people, then you need to isolate old people. You need to provide resources. I mean, what a government policy designed around that kind of disease would say, we're going to have free delivery of groceries to old people or something, so they don't have to go out in public and they can self-segregate whatever, and everybody else, life is going to continue, and we're going to come out with a vaccine, and the old people are going to take the vaccine, and that all makes sense.
Yeah, that didn't happen,
Right.
right?
It didn't. It happened in Sweden, but it didn't happen in a lot of other places. And yeah, it was. It was so. I guess that's what I see as like, I understand concern about funding bioweapons programs. I think everybody's doing that anyway. Maybe a conspiracy theory would be that the Chinese engineered it to kill off their own old people, because it's sort of a reverse of the one-child policy, or like, how is the Chinese state going to take care of all these old people who are not contributing to their economy? So I don't know. I don't know what the origin was of that disease. But I do know that the way we reacted to it wasn't great, and I wish we were more Swedish. And maybe we need to study, like, why is it that all of these other countries had this super pandemic plan in place? Maybe it's the World Health Organization, but I think Sweden's part of that too. So it's like, can we take Swedish culture and can we replicate it? Whatever they're doing right, we need to learn from that because they seem to be the only ones who got it right. I mean,
It's
and
not
if
even a
you're
cultural issue. It's a very simple logic of like there's 200 countries and one of them has done it in a way that's a little bit different, but seems to be overall more effective than what anyone else is doing. So just like straight away, why wouldn't any leader go, oh, well, why don't we try what they're doing? Because it seems like they're not disrupting life and their death rates, all that stuff are not any higher. Right. Just after that, the argument should have been over. And that was like less than a year from the beginning of the outbreak in 2020. But this dragged on into 21, 22. And then you had all the mandates of taking this vaccine that was ultimately ineffective. It didn't do what they said it was going to do, which is stop the spread. So like, all these things compounded into just a slow motion train wreck. And look, like I still will forever hold a grudge for that because it cost me my employment. There was a period where many companies were saying like you have to get the jab or lose your job. So like where's the justice on that? That'll never happen for the vast majority of the people who are affected.
Yeah, that's. I guess I would situate it as, before COVID, I had to take a lot of vaccines for a lot of different reasons, for a lot of different jobs, as did a lot of other people. And there's always been an anti-vaxxer movement. It used to sort of be more left wing, and now it's more right wing. Um, but I don't see that as a new thing. What I see new is, or what I see with COVID is there was an opportunity where there were a lot of bad incentives for a lot of bureaucracies to use a panic in order to get more power and to say, okay, well, because of this, we have to shut down society and reorient it. And, you need a passport to get into a restaurant and, all of that stuff, whether it was necessary or not. And we could see examples maybe where it would be necessary. I mean, if we were in the middle of a war or, there was really the Black Death killing 30% of people or something, you could see examples where you would need a plan like that in place and you would need to implement that plan. And it was like they had that plan and they were ready to implement that plan. And because of these incentives for bureaucracies to always come up with excuses to grow, they just enacted the plan. And then, unfortunately, the population at large. I mean, I know a lot of people who have flopped on this issue, where initially, because I'll just tell you personally, the first month I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to go anywhere. I had the groceries delivered, and I took them in with rubber gloves, and I washed them in the sink with the soap and the water. So I was washing like bags of tea, and it was just crazy. And I did that for like 30 days because I said, well, we don't know what this is. It could mutate. We got to be careful. We don't want to die. I was actually concerned it was going to make everybody infertile. That was my theory. So I was a bit conspiratorial, right? I waited 30 days, and then I looked at the death rate, and I said, we know what this is. We have data. Obviously it could change. If it changes, we should change our behavior. But Fauci said the masks don't work. We don't know how to use the mask, so I'm not going to wear a mask. And then I went on like that. And I did.
Yeah, I mean, it was a test, right? You passed the test earlier than most, and all 300 million American citizens were, had a spectrum of results, and you have some people still living that way. Like I still see people outside wearing masks, for example, or like driving in their car alone wearing a mask. So like that's permanent psychiatric damage, and it's just one of those things that's impossible to quantify. And oh,
well,
by the way, like another knock-on effect that we haven't covered is they used this crisis as Rahm Emanuel, I think, was famous for saying, like never let a crisis go to waste. And they used that opportunity to take power, and it resulted in a pretty fraudulent election in 2020 that ousted Donald Trump. Right? If you want to get rid of a strong American president as any foreign adversary, you're licking your chops because COVID and George Floyd delivered two massive crises that were then amplified with propaganda nonstop. And you get to November where like a lot of these key swing states changed their laws, some of them like in pretty extrajudicial ways. Like, oh, okay, like anyone can mail in a ballot now, and we don't need to do the typical steps we do because it's an emergency. So you just have 3 a.m. vote dumps, and let's count for an extra week. And oh, magically you've got that vertical spike in the middle of the night, or the trickle in over a longer period where a lead in a swing state gets erased, and ultimately Joe Biden becomes the auto pen vegetable president for the next 4 years. And what did that result in? That resulted in like 10, 20 million illegals all coming across the border. So we're still going to be feeling the effects of that 1 year for many years beyond, even now.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously there's demographic differences between Republicans and Democrats. That means that allowing people an easier way to vote, and relaxing voter ID laws, and also the fact that like let's just talk about time preference and who wants to drive 15 minutes to a voting location and stand in line versus you got something in the mail, you fill it out, you drop it off somewhere, on any day, within this 6 month period or whatever it is. Um, so yeah, I think there's a case to be made that the election was close enough that if you hadn't had that massive expansion of mail-in ballots, that it would have swung the other way. I think that's reasonable. Um, as far as the legality of that and what should have been done, it's like COVID was presented as a crisis. Now, whether it was a crisis or not, my opinion is like it was a crisis for the elderly and it should have been treated. I mean, we should have discriminated in terms of age, and we should have said, "Hey, there's this group of people who are vulnerable, and that's what this crisis is about. It's not a 350 million Americans problem. It's an old people problem." So we didn't do that, and it was presented as a general crisis. And Trump took an approach of saying, "I'm going to be hands off with everything except for the vaccines. I'm going to fund the vaccines and push the vaccines." Otherwise, he said it's up to the states, and the states do what they want. And a counterfactual is to say, well, what if there was a crisis, whether it's real or not? There's a crisis, and Trump could have said, you know what, I'm invoking emergency powers, and we're going to do it this way, and here's the plan. And the states don't actually have rights; they're going to do it my way. But if he had
Yes,
taken that,
that would have been a fascinating alternate timeline because when the opposition party has spent the past decade, basically their only position is we want the opposite of Trump. If he actually governed them harder like a daddy during that period, would they have complied or would they have been like us and be like, no, you can't shut down. This is a gross overreach of executive power. So yeah, I mean that's probably the most interesting counterfactual of that whole period. And then on top of that, the whole vaccine, because let's say Trump was the guy who sat there and said that everyone has to get the Trump vaccine, otherwise you lose your job or you can't fly and all that stuff. Do you think anyone on the left would have happily lined up for their shots? I don't think so, right? Like so that's how crazy and bizarre things are, is that there is no more first principles thinking mostly on the left. It's solely just whatever he says I'm against.
yeah, well, there's also a lack of first principles on the right going on, where it's whatever Trump does is good,
Yeah, I
and
mean, sure, sometimes that exists, and like the guy certainly like he's out in front just like bantering and riffing off the cuff. So it's impossible to keep up. Look, that he's just one of a kind like that. He can go and drop, 3 or 4 posts on Truth Social in a day that are just like incredible, and they spin everybody into a frenzy. So this is just how things are now, and we have to navigate for ourselves and make sense of it all and figure out like what principles we need to stick to, who to trust. It's all been a huge upheaval over the past couple of years.
yeah, I kind of reject the idea that Trump is responsible for this kind of nihilism of authority, where we don't know what's real, what's fake, because Trump will say one thing one day, another thing another day. I think he's a manifestation of a trend. And it's also, as you said, on the left, there is sort of an authoritarianism of, Fauci said this and then he said that. And then, we're not going to go from first principles. I want to go back to something you said about the masks. And you're still seeing with people wearing masks and they've been psychologically damaged by COVID. And my pushback on that would be, no, those people were psychologically damaged before COVID. And now that's just a representation, a symbolic kind of, whether it's the blue hair or it's tattoos or it's a COVID mask, it's like people, in some ways, they can't help but signal their own internal state. And that internal state, it's bigger than any particular event, maybe is activated or exacerbated. But I think there are very long-term trends going on.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair point. Who knows what the actual breakdown is of like people who were crazy before COVID, who remain crazy, and now they just have a mask to show people physically, like just steer clear of me. And how many people, like I think there's still a fair chunk of people who were normies, and probably again more. This is probably more in the older demographic where the fear just completely broke them, and they went from being just an average person, didn't think a whole lot about this stuff, to being like a hypochondriac, like recluse, and trying to avoid as much human contact as possible.
Yeah, I mean, these are interesting points. I want to kind of bring this back to religion and talk about it as a crisis of authority. And this is something that's really been exacerbating with Trump, with AI, of what the hell's going on? Are we going into World War III? Is everybody going to die? Is this real? Is this fake? Is it a conspiracy? And I think it has a lot to do with the decline of Christianity, and not just Christian, because I think even when I say that, I don't think I'm being very precise. What I mean specifically is the decline of hierarchical, mainstream, mainline establishment Christianity in the form of an Episcopalian church or a Methodist church. I was just actually looking at the opioid statistics and where that crisis was the worst. And obviously, people talk about the Rust Belt and poverty and unemployment, but actually, it wasn't that bad in Mississippi or Alabama. It was really bad in West Virginia, and it was also really bad in New England and in Massachusetts. And it's like, what do those two places have in common? West Virginia and Massachusetts, not a lot, right? But one of the things that they do have in common, actually, is the fact that they historically were areas of mainline dominance, where there's the Episcopal Church or the Methodist Church versus Mississippi, Alabama, more Baptist, evangelical. These were mainline church areas. And those churches, if you look at young men, they have just left those churches in droves. And so it's been like an entire generation has just evaporated from that church. And the people who are having the deaths of despair and the opioids, they're the same young men. So I actually don't think I don't think it's just about poverty, because there are poorer states in the Union than Massachusetts. And I don't think it's about Christianity in general, because the Baptist evangelicals, they seem to have their own dynamic going on. But I think it's this decline of mainline Methodist, Episcopal, maybe Lutherans. And as that declines, as that authority structure declines in people's lives, you get the rise of people who just never go to church. And, the statistics, you can slice it a number of ways, but I think what you're seeing is a rise of people who claim no religion, and also a rise within Christianity of a decline of all groups, not just the mainline, but also the evangelical. And you see a rise of these non-denominationals, who, if you ask them, what's your theology? What do you believe in? Why do you believe in it? Is it John Calvin? Is it Martin Luther? They just say, oh, I believe in the Bible. I believe in Jesus. I believe in the Holy Spirit. And so it's this completely unmoored, unanchored, free-flowing conception of Christianity, which maybe a lot of people like that. They think it's a better thing. But I also think it opens us up to a lot of hysterical thinking, because when there is a crisis, whether it's COVID or whether it's World War III, or this question of, what's true and false, we can't tell anymore, is it AI? I think when the theology of a growing percentage of Americans is, it's whatever you believe, it's whatever you feel, then that kind of leads to these panics and this mob mentality, as opposed to a theology that says, well, 400 years ago, Martin Luther wrote this book, or John Calvin established that kind of theology, I think, lends itself to more like, when we have a crisis, we look to the authorities, we listen to what they do. Now, obviously, with COVID, you could make the argument that the authoritarian structure didn't work, right? It had a bad idea and we all suffered for it. But I think that in general, the larger trend of just hysterical thinking, populism, conspiratorial thinking, I've talked to these people where, whether it's on the left or the right, they think the country's collapsing, and they think, just the one last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to you, is that Ryan Burge, who's a demographer, a sociologist, and he's also a pastor, he looked at, in the past, people who go to church versus those who don't, and asked them the question, do you trust strangers, or can you trust a stranger? And in every single decade he surveyed, people went to church more, were more trusting. They said, yes, I go to church every week and I think you can basically trust strangers. And they were more trusting than people who never went to church. And this has only really changed in the last 15 years, that now people go to church more, are less trusting than the people who never go to church. That's never been seen before. So it kind of shows you that the nature of Christianity as a stabilizing force for our civilization, that's like, yeah, you can trust people, and you should be kind to strangers, and we're all just looking out for each other, that's actually inverted. And now if you go to church more, you're more likely to say, oh, that person could be a communist, that person could be a whatever, woke, or they could be a Chinese agent or something. And I'm not even empirically saying there aren't Chinese agents or people aren't communists or whatever. I'm just saying that, not even as a moral judgment, just objectively, we've become more suspicious of our fellow Americans in a way that is probably not good for social cohesion. So maybe comment a little bit on what you might agree or disagree in that assessment.
Yeah, you've given me a lot to think about there. I mean, overall, God and the church was the anchor for American society for a long time, and Europe too, right? Europe is far more godless now, but they provided a moral framework and a community that people could grow up with. And of course, like, everyone's going to have their own connection with God, their own way of finding Him, and trying to live by His guidance. And a lot of it also comes from the family. So, like, when both the family and the church have been weakened simultaneously, you just see all of that data of people drifting away from organized religion and being more prone to hysteria because they don't have that anchor to guide them when things get turbulent. And I'm not, I'm one of those non-denominational Christians. I also didn't grow up a Christian. I found it actually during the COVID period. And seems like there's a fair amount of people like that who've discovered or rediscovered deeper faith because of what we saw during that period. Because there's no way you can say that demons don't exist when you just every day would see people losing their minds, and all the forces that were really strong and still are around during that period. But a lot of what we're dealing with is fundamentally a spiritual crisis. And that sits on top of culture, which then flows down to politics. And with with the whole analysis you did of like different areas of America being affected by the opioid crisis and how it maps to different denominations of Christianity. I mean, it's just like in many places, including where I live, it's very hard to find a church where you feel like you're getting the real thing. And once again, you just have the infiltration of the institutions where so many pastors and priests are coming up and straying from what the religion is actually about. And a lot of it's just being used to steer people towards the left. Like the most jarring thing that you see a lot of, and it's only increased over time, is like a lot of churches will be flying a rainbow flag and will be flying a Black Lives Matter flag, and that to me means that that church has been conquered by a civic religion of sorts. And so when you see that happen, of course people are going to leave the church. Of course they're going to find other places to look for community and meaning, because that no longer exists in those specific uh, parishes, if you will. So yeah, and you can't ignore the demographic change too of the past 50 or 60 years. It's been almost unprecedented in history, where you've got 100 million immigrants, legal and illegal, all coming in during this relatively short period in history, and a lot of them are not assimilating. And what that creates is this low trust environment where I think before you could answer that poll and say, like, I trust a stranger, I trust my neighbors, but now you don't, because they speak different languages, they worship very different religions, it's a completely different value system. So once again, just thinking on how this plays out in real life today, 24 years after 9/11, New York might elect a like a jihadist, someone who's very much anti-American, and only became a citizen 8 or 9 years ago. So this is a manifestation of many decades of this subversion, where somehow you've got this magic dirt, and anyone who shows up is just as American as people who've lived here for many generations. It's just science even says that diversity is not a strength, but we're just bombarded every day with that mantra. Like, diversity is a strength, and we should open the borders. Anyone who wants to come here should be able to come here. And now they've taken over vast swaths of this country, especially in the cities, where you can walk around and feel zero connection. Like, how are these my countrymen? Like, are they going to fight and die for me and for the flag, if needed? I don't think so.
My question is, where is the line? When you say that, I mean, it's all very vague, and it's very it appeals to people. I mean, that sentiment, everything you've said there, I think would appeal to the average Trump voter. Um, but I see it as ultimately a hollow sentiment if there is no if it's just an ambiguous thing. And so, there are a lot of studies on diversity and racial diversity, and I mean, I accept that there are costs to assimilation, and even, you could say that black people have been in this country for 400 years, and there's still a distinct culture. There hasn't been this melting pot, where black and white culture has just assimilated and aggregated into a single thing. So maybe that'll never happen. Um, and my question is, like, you know, who are you? Not as I'm not saying that as a you, but I'm just saying, like, who is anybody, if we don't have, some kind of solid authority structure to say, this is what an American is from the top down. What it used to be when the country was founded, was white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Most people in America are not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants today. So if that's what the country was founded on, and that's what the Constitution is really about, and that's now, 9% of the country or something, then, like, what are we even talking about here? What are we? What is this thing when we say, oh, we don't even know who our countrymen are, and they study? I mean, honestly, Hispanics are Catholic. I mean, is Catholicism a strange religion? Probably a lot of the founders may have felt that way, and the Know Nothing Party and the KKK felt that way. But it's like, we've had Catholics in the country pretty prominently. Al Smith as a Democratic candidate 100 years ago. So,
Yeah, look, it's
I
it's
don't
not
know.
so much about drawing a line as just reestablishing what America means. And yeah, of course, like it has evolved so much since its founding, and it will continue to evolve. But what it what makes it harder to maintain a cohesive society is if you bring in a couple million people every year who, the people already here, most of whom are struggling in every sense of the word, like job opportunities, upward mobility, all these things are in a pretty tough situation for the average American. And they're being told, well, these people are going to get free healthcare, free housing, and they probably don't speak English, and you've got a lot of low skill laborers that are undercutting your wages, and then you've got H-1Bs who are taking these programming jobs that apparently our AI is going to get rid of most of them anyway. So this tension is extremely hard to manage, even in smaller numbers. But when you have one party that is just banging the drum nonstop, that like there's no line at all, like it's just no borders, no caps on anything, just bring as many people as possible. There's some who are talking about the abundance of having 1 billion Americans, and like let's sell off a lot of this open land in the West, public
That's
land.
Republicans. That's Republicans.
Yeah,
trying
well,
to
I
sell
know
off
that. I
the-
mean, that's a Republican that most Republicans are repulsed by, and are like, I don't think like the vast majority of the people polled on either
I
side
think,
are like,
yeah. I mean, most
what are you
people on
talking
both
about? Like
sides.
how like we need more housing, but like if you just reduce the supply of all the people who are competing for housing, because a lot of them are not legally here, then that will relieve a lot of the pressure. So you don't have to sell off all this land to most likely like oligarchs who are going to squeeze it for as much profit for themselves as possible. You can't continue privatizing the gains of like mass migration and cheaper labor, while publicizing the downsides of which, like up until recently, you could never even talk about because you'd instantly be branded as all the isms that they like to use.
On housing specifically, I wrote an article about this, and it's true that if we sold off Yosemite and started building condos in Yosemite, that wouldn't solve the problem of housing in New York and LA, because that's not how the housing market works. People live in places primarily because of employment opportunities. And so taking an empty stretch of land in Kansas and building a bunch of empty houses and saying, hey, they're all free, just come live here. It's like, well, if there's no jobs, no one wants to live there. People want to live where there's jobs. And that's why, despite the fact that the populations of LA and New York have been declining, people are leaving the city because it's so expensive and there are problems. And yet the rent's still high. The rent is not crashing. So, I think that the housing problem actually has to do more with old people. I think it has to do with the fact that you've got people who maybe they had a few kids. Now they're in their 60s, 70s, 80s. They refuse to downsize. They refuse to sell their house because there's no pressure for them to do so because they receive Social Security and infinite health care. And so they have no reason to sell because it's equity. It's a speculative investment. And my solution to that is to say, and it'll never happen because AARP is, 1,000 times the size of AIPAC or whatever, and they control all of our elections. But what I would do if I was a neoliberal Stalinist is I would say, if you own a home over $200,000, you don't get a Social Security check. You don't get Medicare. And if you want to receive those benefits, you need to downsize. You need to go in a one-bedroom apartment. And that would solve the problem tomorrow because the vast majority of just housing space in the relevant places, in the desirable places with jobs, the people who are speculating on that equity are the elderly who are being subsidized by the government. So that's the problem.
Well,
it's
look,
not immigrants.
the median age of a home buyer right now is like 50 something. And like first time home buyers are being squeezed out by that because I think, yeah, I mean, most economic activity in the US is based around these metro areas. And you've got this, there's two options, right? You either live in the city, most of which are deteriorating, and they're getting more expensive at the same time, with cost of living, or you go out to the suburbs. And in the suburbs, even more so than the cities, they don't build new inventory. And right, you've got a lot of people who have sat in these houses and watched them appreciate for decades. And it's kind of like being a hermit crab, right? There's this constant churn of you've outgrown your shell. Like maybe you've gotten married, you've had a kid, you're still living in the city, and you need to get out into the suburbs, get a house that has more bedrooms so you can have more kids. That's where the rubber meets the road, because like where can those people go, especially during this period of high interest rates? Like you can't force them to all move into an apartment or an assisted living facility, because there's not that many of those. The weight of the baby boomer demographic is extremely hard to come up with any great solutions for. But what certainly doesn't help, again, is that you have like 20 million illegals. They all need somewhere to live, and in many cities, they're being sheltered in hotels and apartments that otherwise could go to people at a lower market rate. So like, if you go on booking.com and look for a hotel in New York City, or if you go on Zillow and you look for an apartment to rent, you're like, the minimum bar to get anything decent in a decent neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of crime and is relatively convenient is staggering, because of all these pressures just built up. So yeah, I don't know what a great solution is, but certainly the most actionable one is to continue these deportations.
Well, the problem is that even if you deport 1 million people, it's not going to lower the cost of housing, because a
Oh
lot
yeah,
of the
no, by the way, like BlackRock is and all these other big conglomerates are playing around here too, right? They're just,
they own like 5% of the housing supply. It's not it's
yeah, but all these things add up, is
well,
what I'm saying.
I'm
Like
just saying,
you have to,
if there's
yeah.
a big problem, right? You want to go, okay, so let's say we have a pizza pie and we have a number of slices, and you're trying to get rid of this pizza. You got to take care of the biggest slice first. You don't nibble around the edges. So the biggest slice is the $1 trillion we give to old people so that they can speculate on equity. That it's not BlackRock, it's not immigrants. Those people eat around the edges and whatever. But that's the big reason why you look at the case shiller and it's unusually high, is because, as you said, the boomer generation, we have a population pyramid. We have more old people than ever. They have money. They have equity. They could sell their houses and downsize. There's nothing to prevent these people from moving to Kansas. You can get a house for $100,000 in Kansas. They don't need jobs, right? So they don't need to be in cities. They don't need to be in suburbs. They could move to a rural area where the cost of housing is 10 times less, but there's no incentive. The incentive is for them to stay inside their hermit crab shell. So that's the problem. The deportations, unfortunately, are expensive, partially because these people are the construction workers. You want to build new houses and you want to do it cheaply. You're going to need some Mexican laborers. You're going to do it under the table. If you want to hire American, that's going to increase the price of housing. Now, maybe that's good. Maybe we like that because we want to give white people jobs. But that's what it would do in the short term. And maybe that's worth it. But I'm saying the solution to the housing crisis is not deporting 1 million people, because honestly, Mexicans don't own all these 4-bedroom houses in the suburbs. They're like packed like sardines into these dinky little 1-bedroom apartments in places, in
Yeah,
neighborhoods
look,
that basically people don't want to live in anyway. They're replacing the black people in Compton. So white people don't even want to live there, to be honest with you.
yeah, that's funny. I actually heard somebody say that like the great replacement is, Latinos taking over Compton. And I've actually toured Compton before. It was a fascinating experience, because it was a guy who grew up there, was like an ex-con, and this was his way of being a hustler entrepreneur. But it was like me in a van with like 8 European tourists. This was like 5 or 6 years ago in LA. And right, like you look at LA, it's huge. It's like one of the biggest counties in America, population wise and size wise, geographically. And there's only like a small swath of it that people actually want to go to, both to live and be a tourist. And once you start to see these other areas, you're like, wow, this is absolutely insane. But like this has been playing out across the country, and like the housing problem is like such a huge and complicated problem. And so like the solutions to it also are going to take a lot of time, and there's going to be many different levers you can pull. Now here's one
This is
that
old people
could
propaganda.
be, I mean, look, here's one that could be very intriguing is you change the culture around how people live, because since the 50s the dream was you get a white picket fence, and you get a dog and a wife, husband, wife, 3 kids. But that it was not the norm in most human societies for a long time before that. And we've seen it play out where it has this atomizing effect. Everyone's living on their own, and oftentimes they're pretty far away from their family and their friends, and that creates its own social problems. But to bring it back to this housing problem thing, well, look, you have a lot of these older people who are sitting on big homes on their own, or it's like an elderly couple. They probably have a lot of kids and grandkids if they've done it right in their lives. And why not just renormalize multi-generational housing? That takes care of so much, because like I don't know if you have kids or not, but like the cost of childcare is totally mind-boggling. To the point where in a lot of metro areas, like if one of the spouses is not clearing like 150K in their salary, it makes more economic sense for them to not work and just stay at home with the kid. But guess what helps the childcare problem too is, like, you live in a home with free childcare around the house. Like, these are the things you just have to start thinking a bit more out of the box. But you have still a lot of cultural pressure that says that it's weird to have your in-laws live with you or live near you somehow, and like have them be your secondary caretaker after the parents, and not shove them in a daycare with strangers or hire a nanny to come to your house every day, which also is very expensive. And a lot of times these nannies are working, or are illegal, working under the table, and are leaving their own families behind to go take care of your kids. These are phenomenon that have only happened in recent American history. So when you're talking about like how these trend lines get reversed, you do have to consider a lot of other options beyond just like standard policy type stuff.
Well, I'm surprised. I thought I was going to be the leftist here, but it turns out we're going to do everything to avoid. I'm just joking around, but we're going to avoid criticizing Social Security. We're going to blame it on the absolute nuclear family, which is an Anglo-Saxon tradition going back, 1,000 years or something. I mean, really, you can go back and look at the 19th century and look at these wasps and how they behaved, and they didn't want to live with their moms, and that's different from Italian culture and Southern European. Like, that's not the universal European norm.
Yes, but as you said, wasps are only 10% of this country now, right?
No, that's a problem, right? That's a problem.
But I mean, in the 19th century, you had an open frontier. You could just pick up and get yourself acres of a homestead and have the space to breathe and raise a big family, and you were likely self-sufficient. Like, yeah, it's hard work for sure. Like, they don't have anywhere near the material comforts that we have today, but what they did have was space to expand, to have big families, and to work their land. They're not like commuting half an hour to a corporate office and sitting there and generating shareholder value, right? It's just a totally different world. And what we're trying to do here is just try to find solutions to the world that we've been given, of which there are many complicated problems that are all somewhat connected to each other.
Well, see, my difference of opinion is that I don't think the problems are complicated. I think the incentives are perverted. And so I think that no one wants to do the easy but hard thing. And they would rather create a million excuses of why we don't need to do the easy hard thing, or the simple hard. I shouldn't say easy. I should say it's simple. The problem is simple, but the incentives are perverse. So we have an economy and a political economy as well. It's a gerontocracy. It's we have people who they grew up in a time where it was one of the greatest increases of wealth in history. They benefited from that, and now they believe they are entitled to live on a socialist plantation for the rest of their lives in their McMansion. And I don't think that's moral. I don't think that's fair. But it's really difficult to overcome those perverse incentives. But it is simple. And all the other things about, well, maybe we should change the culture, and maybe we got to do something about the immigrants, and maybe it's the zoning laws. And it's like, I don't disagree that those are contributing factors, but in the pizza pie, they are little bits of crust, and the big meaty, the pepperoni.
Yeah, I mean, when you say simple, like when you're trying to make 80 million people move, Like that sounds like to me like the hardest thing ever. So
No, but I'm
yeah, like
arguing
it's
against
conceptually it's
socialism, right? I'm
simple, but
arguing against
yeah.
socialism, which is that these people are subsidized and they're not poor. That's my problem is I want to take care of poor old people. If you're an old person and you have zero equity and like you need to be taken care of, let's give that person housing and food and everything they need, medical care. But if you're living in a McMansion and you're taking, this money, you say, "Well, I paid into it." And it's like, yeah, we all pay taxes, and it's unfortunate that this is the one government program where people feel entitlement. But honestly, again, to your point about young people are the future of the country. We need it. The optimal form of governance isn't based on entitlement, it's based on investment. So we see, okay, if we build this road that connects these two cities, we get more trade, we get more commerce, that grows the country, right?
Yes, I'm totally with you, right? Investment over entitlement, and right, like it has created a lot of resentment because if you just do a little bit of touring of your local real estate market, you see this every time. And of course, like there's definitely a huge overlap between these people who have accumulated a fair amount of equity and wealth in real estate and like what are they doing with their free time? Like they're not helping their kids and their grandkids and really establishing that intergenerational family bond. They're going to no kings protests. Right, and like so yeah, like this becomes really absurd. And you just see this happen time and time again where um, you've not properly cared for your own family, your own descendants, and on top of that, like the country's fallen apart because you are hanging on to all these things that are long run going to be detrimental.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is very strange to see. And, people if people don't want to have a relationship with their children, I mean, even if it was desirable, I don't think that the government is a very effective agent at making parents love their kids or whatever, whatever outcome we want. I don't know what the policy would be to achieve that. But, I think I guess what I'm saying is that while it is difficult for the government to force positive change, um, it is simple. It's still difficult, but it's simple for the government to say, you know what, we are not going to subsidize. And that's, we could talk about the agricultural industry and the corn subsidies and the soy subsidies. And it's like, okay, why is everyone fat? And it's
Yeah, I
like,
mean, for sure, like incentives are the most powerful thing, and you want to incentivize good behavior, disincentivize bad behavior. But at the end of the day, everyone who's elected to national office has to face, just face the the cruel fact of like most of the people who go and pull the lever in the ballot box are going to be from that demographic that you're trying to encourage to open up housing and all these other things. Like that's where the simple becomes almost impossible
well,
because
this
they're
is
pretty much held hostage by what was it, the AARP, right? Like this like gigantic highly engaged voter bloc.
Yeah, I mean, it's the biggest lobbying organization, AARP. Um, so this is
I feel
why
like you need to blow that up more. It's like, everyone's so busy talking about the NRA and APAC and whatnot, but the
yeah,
AARP
no,
is
I
is
mean, this
truly
is
the massive gorilla in the room.
it is, and so I say, young people of the world unite, and this is why we need a tyrannical deep state. We need someone to go Fauci mode on the old people, and
Yeah.
I'm
By the way,
joking,
the
but
deep state is comprised by these tenured, long-standing people who have been around for decades. So, like, yeah, like
well,
you gotta get fresh blood. You gotta get young people to coalesce more and try to advocate for their own interests. But there's just fewer of us, and we're also extremely fragmented. Like where's the AARP for young people? I don't think that exists. Maybe we got to start it.
yeah.
But on top of that, you just have a much different demographic. Everyone's got different interests based on more of these tribal identitarian things, which is unfortunate, right? Like we shouldn't break apart like that, but that's what's happened, and it's very hard to put Humpty Dumpty back together and really organize effectively the way that that generation has.
Wow. I mean, yeah, I guess that seems obvious that you got a bunch of old white people and they're just like working together very well. And then you've got a very diverse Gen Z and they're all over the place. I mean, the you look
Yeah,
at
like
the
they all watch Fox and CNN and MSNBC, so they're very much in lockstep. Whereas the Zoomers, millennials, they're watching thousands of different TikToks and Instagrams and Substacks or whatever. So it's extremely hard. Like just everything's so fragmented in the culture to come to what I think is a pretty sensible conclusion that you and I have is that just that there has to be more advocacy for the things that really matter because a lot of it is just performative. It doesn't really impact your life, but housing is one of the and healthcare. You know, all these things are extremely impactful to you day to day.
yes. I want to check in with you because we've covered a lot of topics here. I didn't establish, your time,
This
your
has been
time
fun. We're
zones.
doing a good weave. I can probably hang it on for another 5 or 10 minutes. So
Okay, sounds
yeah,
good.
fire away.
So I've been kind of interrogating you and asking you these tough questions. Um, what sort of things turn it around? What sort of things do you think that are maybe I'm not interrogating, or what are the sort of things that you feel like are my unexamined prejudices or the elephant in the room? I don't know if you've read any of my stuff or what you've read or what your appraisal is, but give me some constructive criticism.
Well, I don't want to put you through a struggle session. You've been a gracious host, and this has been a fun and fascinating conversation here. I don't know if there's any blind spots or critiques. I do think we just have to spend more time evaluating like what do we want the culture to be in a long term span. We're in this very unique period where there's just lots of change, but I don't know. Like once you start having kids, you start to think on a different timeline entirely. And when you have the end point in mind of like, I want my children and my grandchildren to flourish, and I want to live near them in a place that's safe and clean and has good social cohesion. Yeah, how do you get there? And I think one of the most important ways is through better culture and education because we've just endured a decade of slop. Hollywood, all these creative places have been completely captured to the point of idiocy and parody, but they still have the economics behind them. They've got a never-ending stream of leftist donors who want to agitate for those causes, and the right is still very much outgunned in that regard. It's like we won one election, it's a huge victory, and Trump's in there doing his thing, but he's not going to be around for that much longer, and you have to prepare long term and kind of take that long march back that we've seen play out for 50, 60 years. Going back to the beginning of like the Cultural Revolution, Yuri Bezmenov's warnings, all the Marxists taking over the institutions. Yeah, how do you build new ones? How do you establish better alternatives? Because shit posting is effective, and we should keep doing it as much as we can. But there just has to be longer lasting, aspirational, beautiful things to go after. So I've been writing a fair amount about that, throwing around some ideas on how exactly to make that a reality. But I think that's something that we should all consider because we're going to be around for hopefully another 50, 60 years.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good wrap up conclusion here. Um, I'm sure that we could come up with some more divisive issues to go back and forth, but you're working on, as you say, kind of maybe developing a positive vision for what you want in the future, and people can go check that out, and uh, we'll we'll maybe do this again sometime, or maybe have some article article dueling. One thing we didn't really get into directly was that idea of irony and subversion and critique and sort of making fun of the establishment. I see you've got, like, I scroll through your timeline, I see Masha Gessen, which I haven't been following Masha Gessen, but apparently Masha Gessen has transitioned and has a beard or something now. And it's easy to look at Masha Gessen and be like, who is this freak? And this old I guess not a Soviet dissident, she's a Putin dissident, and or they them, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? So it's like you can look at these people who are clearly narcissistic and they're easy to make fun of because it's like they're screaming at you about their pronouns, or they're telling you how you got to respect their whatever. And it's very clear, like, the personality disorder that motivates those people, and you can hold them up and you can say, this is sort of everything evil, we need to get rid of these people and we need to put in a new batch of people. And the problem that I see is maybe it's kind of what you're talking about with this idea of a positive vision, is that we've got Trump, we've got Rubio, we've got Hegseth, we've got Vance, we've got these people in power. And I see it. I mean, this is a pretty common critique. It's nothing revolutionary on my part, but it's just like, it's at best 1990s liberalism. It's maybe even just like 2009 Obama. It's kind of like, we're doing detentions and deportations. We're putting kids in cages, and we're not doing gay marriage. Or, yeah, actually, they are doing gay marriage. So it's even past that. I don't know what year we're trapped in with Republicans, but that's the issue. Is it's like, we are trapped in a certain year, and maybe that makes people feel more comfortable. I certainly probably feel more comfortable looking at Donald Trump and listening to Donald Trump versus Masha Gessen. But at the same time, as it's maybe an alleviation, it's a relaxation, it's like a calm down, relief. Oh, I don't have to deal with those crazy freaks anymore. And now we have real adults in charge. But actually, I don't actually feel like it's anything other than a regression. And I mean, that's kind of the definition of a conservative, right? So we got to slow things down. And so, I don't see directionally how that's changing the destiny of the country when you have people like Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley and all these other people who are coming in. And it's like, with the bombings, it's like, are we back? Is it neocons again? Is it Bush again? It's like, do we actually have a coherent ideology other than Masha Gessen is ugly? Because I see that a lot on the right is like, well, obviously these people are freaks and we don't want to deal with them. But is there a coherent idea of because the left has something. It could be evil, it could be crazy.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's like enough of a question for like a whole another hour and a half. But right, like at least there's enough people who understand how ugly that is and the urgency of making changes quick, because there's still tens of millions of people who like Masha Gessen and the New York Times, and she'll get way more eyeballs than we ever will for now. And these are people who want all of us in a gulag. They want Trump and Hegseth to be thrown in jail, maybe even executed, right? Like this is still what we are up against. And I'm doing a piece on Friday about looking at like who the biggest Substack authors are and how independent they are, because of course Substack, they've done a great job. I love their team. They've stood up for us on free speech. But this claim of like, we're the hub, this is the home for independent journalists and writers, it's not quite true, because a lot of the biggest writers on Substack are just the mainstream media hacks who recently left CNN and MSNBC. So if you just stack up their numbers versus ours, we are still so very far behind. So we just have to keep remembering that. We have to use that to motivate us and ultimately arrive at a place where we've created something beautiful, awe-inspiring, just far superior, that future generations will look up to, and all of this will fade away and hopefully just be a dark little period in history that no one will want to go back to. And more importantly, they know they don't want this and want something better. So let's all pull towards that, comrades.
All right, call to action. Yuri, You've assembled the troops. Everybody's fired up. I mean, I don't know about my audience, so we have a different opinion over here. But your troops are
Yeah, look,
fired up.
I appreciated your challenges. I welcome anyone who's listened or who follows you to yeah, bring the heat. I can take it. I'm a big boy.
All
But
right,
yeah,
cool. No,
we'll
I
keep testing it.
appreciate
Yeah.
that.
All right.
Awesome. We'll leave it there. Thank you, and take care. I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks.
All
Be well.
righty. Bye bye. All right.